In 1986, a British author named Clive Barker published a novella titled The Hellbound Heart. It would go on to be the basis for one of the most popular horror franchises in history, spawning 9 sequels, a television series, comics, video games, and more. But despite being the source material for all that came after, Hellbound Heart has only been read by a fraction of those who have watched or enjoyed the films. That's because while Barker's work has become synonymous with gruesome practical effects and sadistic creatures, his original story is actually much more restrained, relying instead on atmosphere and psychological horror to disturb its readers. So, how did the world get turned onto sadistic puzzle boxes and chainsaws, and why do so many people think they're missing a body part now? Well, join us as we count down the top 10 craziest things you never knew about Hellbound Heart. Number 10. It took 3 years to write. Unlike the films, which often take months from script to screen, books require a lot more time to put pen to paper, and the author had no intention of rushing this one. In fact, he'd been thinking about writing it for almost a decade before it was done. You see, Barker was first inspired to write Hellbound Heart while reading an article about sadomasochism in New York Magazine. Immediately, he began drafting ideas for a story about a woman who finds her desires exploited by supernatural forces. But it was until he met artist and future film producer Andrew MacPhail that the concept really started taking shape. Realizing there was an opportunity to push boundaries where traditional publishers wouldn't let him, Barker and McPherson formed their own company called New English Library and began planning their first publication, which would eventually be titled The Hellbound Heart. No, and 9. There was another story first. Technically, The Hellbound Heart wasn't the very first story set in Barker's imagined universe, but it is the first story you need to read if you want to understand the lore surrounding it. That's because Barker had already written a short story titled The Surgeon, which serves as a sort of prequel. That story is about a man who kills his wife after she asks for a divorce and then tries to bring her back to life using black magic. He ends up summoning a demon instead, who mutilates him physically and psychologically. The story's protagonist becomes known as the Engineer and is featured heavily throughout the Hellraiser franchise. But unlike the films, which begin with the infamous puzzle box, the novella actually begins with the story of the surgeon. So if you want to know how it all began, you should definitely check out the short story collection that includes The Surgeon, as well as several other tales set in Barker's universe. It's titled In a Watcher's World. Number 8. It was originally banned. One of the reasons Barker and McPherson formed their own publishing company was because they knew mainstream publishers would untouch something as graphic as Hellbound Heart, and they were right. After all, the story revolves around sadomasochism and features plenty of sex, nudity, gore, and even That's why the book was originally published under a different title, The Scarlet Gospels. But when the story was adapted to film, director and co-writer Tony Randall suggested a new title based on the puzzle box that features prominently in the story. Everyone loved it, except for the publisher, who thought it sounded like a children's book. Still, that title stuck, and the film became a huge success. Upon its release, the book was then re-released under the same title, which led to yet another problem. See, the name Cenobite was already being used by a band at the time, so Barker and McPherson had to change the name to Cenobites, but not everyone was happy about that either. Fans of the band weren't exactly thrilled about the change, but no one was more upset than Barker himself. In fact, he hated the name change so much that he spelled the word C-E-N-O-B-I-T-E-S without the H. Ever since 7, we all know the basic plot of Hellraiser. A puzzle box is brought into the house, and anyone who solves it summons a group of sadistic demons who drag them to hell. But what most people don't realize is that it's actually about more than just sadistic demons and puzzle boxes. At its heart, the story is actually a love story between 2 men, Frank Cotton and Larry Cotton, who happen to be brothers. You see, Frank wants to experience all the pleasures and pains of the flesh, both physical and spiritual. Larry, on the other hand, doesn't want anything to do with the puzzle box or the otherworldly realm it opens up. In fact, he despises his brother for experimenting with such dangerous things. Unfortunately, Frank's blood gets on Larry's hands, and he accidentally summons the In a way, the rest of the story is about Larry coming to terms with his feelings for his brother and ultimately sacrificing himself to save him. Number 6. It's not about sex. While the story contains plenty of sexual themes, it's not actually a story about sex. Instead, Barker uses sex to explore themes of carnal desire and what happens when that desire consumes someone. In the story, Frank isn't satisfied with normal human relationships. He wants more. He wants something bigger and better. He believes the Lament configuration can lead him to that, and so he puts all his efforts into solving it. That's why, in a deleted scene from the first film, Frank tells Larry, there's got to be more than this. There's got to be something beyond the senses, something more. It's also why Frank is willing to sacrifice Julia and Larry to get to hell. Sex is simply a tool for him to attain greater knowledge. No. 5. Frank gets away with it. In the first film, Frank is killed when Larry shoots him, and he's torn apart by the but in the book, he actually gets away with it. In fact, he and Julia are able to summon the Cenobites whenever they want to indulge in their darkest desires, and they use that power to kill Larry and his wife in order to make Frank's daughter with Julia. Ultimately, Kirsty is able to escape, and the story ends with her leaving the house and walking down the street. Frank and Julia laugh maniacally inside. Of course, that ending would be considered too ambiguous for Hollywood, so the producers decided to change it for the movie. 4. It was filmed in 26 days. As we mentioned earlier, movies require much less time to produce than books, and Hellraiser was filmed in record time, just 26 days. Director Tony Randall knew that he had a small budget, so he made sure to plan ahead and shoot everything efficiently. For example, he shot all the scenes featuring Kirsty and Frank in one location, because he couldn't afford to move his set. Additionally, he made use of natural lighting as much as possible and avoided using artificial lighting. As a result, the movie was completed in just over a month, which was a miracle considering the amount of practical effects that needed to be added later. 3. The author cameoed in the film. When it was announced that Hellraiser was being adapted to the big screen, Barker was skeptical. He knew the story contained elements that wouldn't translate well to film, such as the mental anguish Frank endures. Plus, he was worried that the graphic nature of the story would be lost in translation. Despite these concerns, he agreed to serve as an executive producer on the film, and even wrote the novelization. But he wanted to do more, so he also made a cameo appearance as a doctor who examines Frank after he is mutilated by the Cenobites. Note too, Pinhead wasn't always the star. While Doug Bradley is undoubtedly the most famous actor to play Pinhead, he wasn't the first choice for the role. In fact, the role was initially offered to actor Andrew Robinson, who turned it down because he was busy filming Dirty Dancing at the time. From there, the role went to Oliver Smith, who played Pinhead in the first 2 films. But Smith was ultimately replaced by Bradley after he asked for more money in the 3rd installment. Some fans prefer Bradley's portrayal, while others feel that Smith's performance was more menacing. But there's no denying that both actors brought something unique to the role. And no, 1. Not every Cenobite. While the Cenobites are known for their sadistic tendencies, not all of them are like that. In fact, some of them are quite compassionate. For example, there's Butterball, who helps Kirsty escape in the first film. And then there's Chatterer, who seems genuinely sorry for what he and his fellow Cenobites have to do to humans. In the original story, Chatterer actually explains why the Cenobites do what they do. He says, "We have to do what we do. If we stop, the universe will die. You can't stop the wheel. All you can do is get off your knees and open your eyes. See the truth." Well, that's it for this video. But if you've watched until now, thank you. We'll see you next time.